Nigel Farage Reform UK is falling apart before our very eyes, and the truth is finally out. This isn't just internal disagreements, nor is it about leadership battles or media spins. No. This is something much deeper, something that exposes the party for what it truly is, or perhaps, for what it has always been. A controlled opposition. A safety valve. A political mirage designed to give people hope while ensuring nothing really changes. And the proof. Look at what just happened to Rupert Lowe. Censored. Silenced. Expelled. All for saying something that, ironically, should be at the very heart of reform's agenda. He dared to demand mass deportations of illegal migrants, a policy that aligns perfectly with what Reform UK has claimed to stand for. And yet, instead of standing by him, instead of backing a strong, no-nonsense stance on immigration, Nigel Farage threw him under the bus. Now, the party is in full-blown crisis mode. Keir Starmer is sitting back, watching the chaos unfold, knowing that every fracture, every betrayal within Reform only strengthens Labour's grip on power. And here's the real question. Has Nigel Farage been playing his supporters all along? Is Reform UK truly an anti-establishment force? Or has it been nothing more than a carefully curated illusion? Think about it. Nigel Farage has built his entire political career on the image of being the ultimate outsider, the man who took on the European Union and won with Brexit. He positioned himself as the voice of the people, unafraid to speak the truth, to challenge the status quo. But now, suddenly, we see a different Farage. A Farage who hesitates. A Farage who backtracks. A Farage who turns against the very people within his own party who are willing to take real action. Why? Because Rupert Lowe dared to say what everyone already knows. Britain has an immigration crisis, and it won't be solved with weak language and half measures. Reform UK was supposed to be the party that took on the political establishment, the party that actually listened to the concerns of ordinary Britons. And yet, here we are, watching it crumble from within. This is no mere political dispute. This is an existential battle over what reform actually stands for. Rupert Lowe, a key figure within the party, was a staunch advocate for hardline immigration policies. His stance was crystal clear: if you enter Britain illegally, you should be deported. Full stop. No compromises. No loopholes. And not just that, he argued that foreign criminals, particularly those with dual nationality, should be sent back to their home countries without hesitation. And yet, despite this being an entirely logical, legal, and necessary approach, Nigel Farage shut him down. Why? Because he claimed that phrases like mass deportations and repatriation were too extreme. He called them dangerous. He said they were politically unworkable. But let's ask the real question here. What is truly dangerous? Words? Or an immigration system that allows criminals to remain in Britain under the excuse of human rights? Farage's move wasn't just about language. It was about control. It was about ensuring that Reform UK does not get labelled as too extreme. But in doing so, Farage has revealed the biggest secret of all. Reform might not be as anti-establishment as it claims. Because if it were, why would it be so afraid to take decisive action on immigration? Why is it bending over backwards to avoid offending the same political elites it supposedly opposes? And it gets worse. Not long after Rupert Lowe was expelled, one of Reform's regional offices was shut down by party leadership. Why? Because it had criticised Islam. That's right. The so-called bold and fearless party, the one that claims to stand against woke censorship, is now actively silencing discussions on cultural and religious issues as well. Does this sound like a party that is truly willing to challenge the system? Or does it sound like another managed opposition? An outlet designed to absorb the anger of disillusioned voters while ensuring that nothing meaningful ever changes? Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is loving every second of this disaster. With Reform imploding, Labour's path to power is only becoming easier. And if Nigel Farage is too afraid to even say the words mass deportations, how can anyone possibly believe that Reform UK would ever have the backbone to actually enforce them? The cracks in Reform are widening by the day. And the bigger question now is, was this always the plan? Is Nigel Farage really the political maverick he claims to be? Or has he been playing his supporters from the start? Because here's the reality. Rupert Lowe's removal wasn't just about a disagreement over words. It was a deliberate political move, a move that raises serious questions about what Nigel Farage and Reform really stand for. Think about it. Reform UK built its entire brand on the idea of challenging the establishment, on taking bold stances that the mainstream parties were too weak to take. But the moment someone like Rupert Lowe actually tries to implement those bold policies, he is shut down, branded as too extreme, and thrown out of the party. We've seen this tactic before. It's the classic playbook of controlled opposition. Establishment-backed parties pretend to be on the side of the people. But the second someone within their ranks pushes for real action, they are silenced. And now, it's happening inside Reform. The truth is, Reform is looking more and more like a political decoy, a place for disillusioned voters to pour their energy into, while ensuring that none of that energy ever translates into real political consequences. Look at Farage's response to this entire situation. Instead of standing firm, instead of defending his party's core message, what did he do? He ran to the mainstream media to distance himself from mass deportations. He assured the press that Reform wasn't that radical, that it wasn't advocating for drastic immigration measures. But here's the problem. That's exactly what Reform UK voters want. And yet, Farage deliberately painted Lowe's proposals as unrealistic, as if removing illegal migrants and foreign criminals is some kind of political fantasy. But it's not. It's the law. Rupert Lowe was merely stating that, under existing UK legislation, foreign criminals can and should be deported. Yet Farage made it sound like an extremist position. And that tells you everything you need to know. Farage isn't worried about fixing Britain's immigration crisis. He's worried about how the media and political class perceive him. And that's where Keir Starmer comes in. Labour doesn't even need to fight Reform anymore. Reform is doing Labour's job for them. By silencing Lowe, Farage has sent a clear message. Reform UK is not serious about immigration, and Starmer knows it. This isn't just about Rupert Lowe. This isn't just about Nigel Farage Reform Party. This is about a much bigger political game, a long drawn-out operation designed to neutralise any real opposition before it can ever become a genuine threat. And we've seen this play out before. UKIP once had momentum. It shook the political landscape. It forced the Conservatives to take Brexit seriously. And then, suddenly, infighting, leadership purges, and internal chaos tore it apart. And now, Reform is walking the exact same path. So, the final question remains, was this the plan all along? Was Reform ever meant to succeed? Or was it always just another political illusion, another way to trick voters into thinking they had an alternative, while ensuring that nothing ever changes? Because if Nigel Farage was serious about fighting for Britain, he wouldn't be backing down. He wouldn't be censoring his own party members. He would be standing firm, refusing to compromise, refusing to let the establishment dictate the rules of engagement. But instead, what is he doing? Watching as Reform collapses from within. And that tells you everything. Nigel Farage Reform UK is collapsing in real time, and what's happening inside the party should send shockwaves through British politics. This is not just a political disagreement, not just a clash of personalities. This is something far more serious. A party that claimed to be the last hope for those disillusioned with the establishment is now tearing itself apart from the inside. And at the center of it all, a betrayal so blatant that it raises the question, was Reform UK ever meant to be a true alternative? Or was it always designed to fail? The scandal exploded when Rupert Lowe, one of the party's most outspoken figures on immigration, was silenced, censored, and ultimately expelled. His crime? Saying something that every Reform UK supporter already believes, that Britain's immigration crisis requires real action, not political cowardice. He argued for mass deportations of illegal migrants, a policy that should align perfectly with Reform's stated goals. And yet, Nigel Farage didn't back him, he turned on him. Think about that. The man who built his career on defying the establishment, on speaking uncomfortable truths, suddenly decided that some truths are too uncomfortable to say. Why? What's changed? Why is the same Nigel Farage who once spoke boldly about border control now afraid of his own party's hardliners? The answer is as disturbing as it is obvious. Control. This was never just about language. This was about ensuring Reform UK doesn't go too far, about keeping the party within a safe, manageable limit. Because if Reform UK was truly anti-establishment, truly willing to shake the political landscape, why would it be afraid to act on its core promises? Why would it be so eager to appease the same elites it claims to be fighting against? Lowe's stance wasn't radical, it was the law. The UK Borders Act 2007 clearly states that any foreign national sentenced to more than a year in prison must be deported. That's not an extreme position. That's existing legislation. And yet, thanks to weak leadership, activist lawyers, and interference from the European Court of Human Rights, this law is barely enforced. Britain's immigration system has become a joke, a system that bends over backwards to protect criminals at the expense of law-abiding citizens. So when Rupert Lowe stepped up and said reform should stop the excuses and take real action, what did Farage do? He shut him down. He threw him out. And not just that, he denounced him, calling terms like mass deportations too dark, too dangerous. But let's ask the real question. What's actually dangerous? Words. Or a broken immigration system that allows foreign criminals to roam Britain with impunity? And it gets worse. Shortly after Lowe's removal, one of Reform's regional offices was shut down for criticizing Islam. That's right. Reform, the supposed anti-woke party, the party that prides itself on free speech and standing up to censorship, is now actively silencing its own members for discussing cultural and religious issues. Let that sink in. Reform is not just afraid of hardline immigration policies, it's terrified of even having the conversation. Does that sound like a movement that is ready to take on the establishment? Or does it sound like controlled opposition? A party designed to soak up the anger of disillusioned voters, only to ensure that anger never turns into real political change? And do you know who benefits from this? Keir Starmer. Labour doesn't need to attack Reform when Reform is doing the job for them. By betraying Lowe, Farage has sent a message to voters loud and clear. Reform is not serious about immigration. And Starmer knows it. That's why Labour is barely reacting to this so-called civil war within Reform. They don't need to. Reform is crumbling on its own, destroying itself before it ever becomes a real threat. And that's exactly how the establishment wants it. The cracks are only growing. And it forces us to ask, was this always the plan? Was Nigel Farage ever truly an outsider? Or has he been playing a much more calculated game all along? Because if you look at his track record, a pattern begins to emerge. Remember UKIP? It started as a powerful, populist force that genuinely scared the political class. It shook the Conservatives to their core, forced Brexit onto the agenda, and redefined British politics. And then, infighting, leadership purges, sudden betrayals. The party that was once a real threat was neutralized from within, until it was no longer a danger to anyone. And now, the exact same thing is happening with Reform. Think about how different this could have been. Imagine if, instead of denouncing Rupert Lowe, Farage had defended him. Imagine if he had stood firm and said, yes, we believe in enforcing immigration laws. Yes, we will remove foreign criminals. Yes, we will challenge the European Court of Human Rights if necessary. The Reform base would have exploded with energy. The party would have gained momentum. Labour would be terrified. But that's not what happened. Instead, Farage capitulated. He let the establishment dictate what Reform can and cannot say. He allowed the media to frame the debate. Instead of fighting, he folded. And that is not the behavior of a man who wants to win. That is the behavior of a man who is playing a role. And that role is clear. Keep right-wing voters trapped in an endless cycle of hope and betrayal. Give them just enough to keep them engaged, but never allow them to build a movement that could actually challenge the system. And it's working. Right now, Reform voters are demoralized. Many are realizing, maybe for the first time, that Nigel Farage might not be the hero they thought he was. That the man who built his career on defying the establishment is now enforcing the establishment's rules. That Reform UK was never meant to be a real political alternative. It was just a carefully managed illusion. And if that's true, then where does that leave Britain? It leaves us exactly where the establishment wants us, divided, disorganized, and with no real opposition to the system that has failed this country for decades. Labour wins. The Conservatives cling on just enough to pretend they're still relevant. And Reform? It collapses. Because that's how the game is played. But here's the most important part. It didn't have to be this way. Farage had a choice. He could have backed his party's original mission. He could have fought for the people who trusted him. He could have defied the establishment once again. Instead, he betrayed them. And history will remember. Nigel Farage Reform UK is disintegrating before our eyes, and it's becoming increasingly clear that this is no ordinary political crisis. This isn't about a rogue party member going too far, nor is it about internal disagreements over strategy. No, this is about control, about ensuring that Reform UK never becomes a real political threat. The question we should all be asking is, was this the plan from the beginning? Rupert Lowe's expulsion wasn't just a disciplinary action. It was a calculated purge. A deliberate move to send a message, not just to him, but to every Reform member who might dare to push for real action. This is how political parties are neutralized from within. Not with external attacks or election losses, but through self-sabotage, through leadership that bends the knee the moment things get too serious. Look at what happened next. Not long after Lowe was expelled, one of Reform's regional offices was shut down. Why? Because it had criticized Islam. That's right, the same party that claimed to be against woke censorship, the same party that positioned itself as the defender of free speech, is now silencing its own members for merely discussing cultural and religious issues. How does that make any sense? This is the party that was supposed to be fearless, the party that promised to say what no one else dared to say. And yet, here it is, running scared at the first sign of controversy. What happened to standing firm? What happened to challenging the establishment? Or was that all just a sales pitch to lure in disillusioned voters? This isn't just incompetence, it's a betrayal. And the biggest beneficiary of this disaster? Keir Starmer. Labour doesn't need to fight Reform UK when Reform is destroying itself. Starmer is sitting back, watching the chaos unfold, knowing full well that a weak, divided Reform Party only strengthens his own position. And if Nigel Farage is too afraid to even say the words mass deportations, how can anyone believe that Reform UK would ever have the backbone to actually enforce them? The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. This is not just a fight over policy. This is a fight over the soul of the party. Reform was created to challenge the status quo, to offer a real alternative to the endless cycle of Tory weakness and Labour incompetence. And yet, at the very moment when it could become a serious force, it is collapsing from within. Why? Because this is what controlled opposition looks like. We've seen this play out before. Remember UKIP? A party that once had the establishment trembling, a party that reshaped British politics, a party that forced Brexit onto the agenda, until suddenly, it was gone. Torn apart by infighting, leadership struggles, and internal betrayals. And now, the exact same thing is happening to Reform. Coincidence? Or a pattern? The signs are all there. First, Reform attracts a base of passionate, disillusioned voters who desperately want change. Then, it builds momentum, starts making headlines, starts looking like it might actually threaten the political order. And then, sudden purges. Leaders backtracking. Internal chaos. Every time, right when these movements are on the verge of real power, something happens to derail them. And let's not ignore the media's reaction to all of this. When was the last time we saw the mainstream press supporting Nigel Farage? The same media that spent years calling him a racist, a xenophobe, a danger to democracy. Suddenly, when he turns against Rupert Lowe, they applaud. Suddenly, Farage is responsible for rejecting extremism. Suddenly, the very same newspapers that have spent years tearing him apart are treating him as the voice of reason. That should set off alarm bells. Because real opposition is never embraced by the media. A real anti-establishment party would be relentlessly attacked, regardless of who it expelled. Instead, we see the press validating Farage's decision. Why? Because they know it weakens Reform. They know it keeps the party in check. They know it ensures Reform remains a party that talks big but never delivers. And here's where it gets even worse. Farage himself has spent months talking about leaving the European Court of Human Rights and repealing the Human Rights Act. Why? Because these laws allow foreign criminals and illegal migrants to stay in Britain, even when the law explicitly states they should be deported. And yet, now he says mass deportations are too extreme? That is a direct contradiction of everything Reform UK has promised. If Reform truly wanted to leave the ECHR, if it truly believed in border control, then Lowe's plan wouldn't be extreme. It would be common sense. But the fact that Farage shut it down so quickly tells us something else is going on. Either he never intended to follow through on Reform's promises, or he is under pressure from powerful forces behind the scenes to keep Reform from going too far. Either way, it is a betrayal of every voter who supported him. And while this chaos unfolds, Keir Starmer is loving every second of it. Labour doesn't have to work for their victory. They don't have to earn the public's trust. They just have to sit back and watch as Reform UK implodes. And if that wasn't bad enough, consider who else benefits from this. The Conservatives. Yes, the Tories are weak. Yes, they are bleeding voters. But the one thing they cannot afford is for those voters to have a real alternative. They need Reform to fail. They need to be able to say, look, Reform is too chaotic, too divided, you have no choice but to vote for us. And thanks to Farage's actions, that's exactly the narrative they can push. Ask yourself, why hasn't Farage stepped in to take control? He is the most powerful figure in the party, the face of the movement. He could have put an end to this crisis immediately. But he hasn't. Instead, he is distancing himself, allowing the party to tear itself apart. That is not the behavior of a leader who wants to win. That is the behavior of a man who is following a script. This is how controlled opposition works. You create a movement, attract supporters, make them believe change is possible, and then, right when they start demanding real action, you shut it down. And the most terrifying part? It's working. Right now, Reform voters are demoralized. Many are realizing for the first time that Nigel Farage might not be who they thought he was. That the man who built his career on defying the establishment is now enforcing its rules. That the party they believed in might just be another illusion. And if that's the case, where does that leave Britain? It leaves us exactly where the establishment wants us. Trapped. With no real opposition. With no serious challenge to Labour or the Tories. With voters forced back into the same old system that has failed them for decades. Keir Starmer wins. The Conservatives cling on just enough to remain relevant. And Reform? It collapses. Because that was always the plan. Farage had a choice. He could have fought for his party's original mission. He could have stood by the people who trusted him. He could have defied the establishment once again. Instead, he betrayed them. And history will remember. Nigel Farage Reform UK is no longer looking like a revolutionary movement. It's looking like a carefully managed illusion. A political pressure valve designed to absorb public frustration while ensuring that nothing actually changes. The party that was meant to challenge the establishment is now crumbling under its own contradictions, and the people who put their hopes in it are beginning to realize the truth. Reform was never meant to win. Look at how Farage has handled this crisis. Instead of standing by his party's core message, instead of fighting for the policies that Reform voters support, he ran straight to the Telegraph to reassure the establishment that he is not in favor of mass deportations. That's right, the man who built his brand on tough immigration policies is now distancing himself from them at the very moment his party should be doubling down. Why? Why is the same Nigel Farage who spent years attacking the political elite now so desperate to appease them? Why, when his own party is on the brink of implosion, is he more concerned with reassuring the mainstream media than leading his supporters into battle? This isn't just about Lowe. This is bigger. This is about who really controls Reform UK. Because if Farage was serious about enforcing border laws, he would not be calling mass deportations an unrealistic fantasy. He would be fighting to make them a reality. And that's where the betrayal becomes undeniable. Because Rupert Lowe wasn't proposing some radical, fringe idea, he was citing the law. Under existing UK legislation, foreign criminals who serve a prison sentence of more than a year must be deported. That's not extremism. That's not an unworkable policy. That is the law. But instead of defending it, Farage made it sound dangerous. He made it seem like a step too far. And by doing that, He exposed what many suspected all along. Reform UK is not a serious political movement. It is a managed opposition party, designed to contain the discontent of British voters without actually challenging the system. And here's the most damning part: Keir Starmer doesn't even have to attack Reform. Because Reform is doing Labour's job for them. The party is imploding all by itself, ensuring that Starmer and Labour face no real opposition in the next election. Think about it. Why do you think Labour isn't even reacting to this so-called civil war within Reform? Why isn't Starmer out there trying to capitalise on the chaos? Because he doesn't need to. Reform is self-destructing. And that, more than anything else, should make people stop and question who benefits from all of this. Reform was supposed to be the party that stood against the establishment. The party that actually listened to the concerns of the people. But now it's clear, it is falling apart from within, and it's happening in a way that is far too convenient for those in power. And this brings us to the biggest question of all. Was this the plan all along? Because let's be honest, the timing is too perfect. Reform was building momentum. It had the potential to become a real electoral force, a genuine alternative to Labour and the Tories. But now it's in chaos. Now it's shutting down its own members. Now it's watering down its own policies. And at the centre of it all, Nigel Farage. This is the man who has spent his entire career claiming to fight for the British people. The man who sold himself as the ultimate political outsider. The man who delivered Brexit and who promised to take the battle even further. But what has he actually done with Reform? The moment things got serious, the moment the party had a real chance to become a major political force, the cracks began to show. Instead of leading a bold movement, he has allowed Reform to become just another toothless opposition party, one that makes a lot of noise but ultimately changes nothing. Instead of standing by his own people, he is silencing them. Instead of pushing for real policy change, he is assuring the media that he won't be too extreme. Does that sound like a man who wants to shake up the system? Or does that sound like a man who is following a carefully scripted role? And let's not forget, the media's reaction to all of this tells you everything you need to know. The same media that spent years attacking Farage, that branded him as a dangerous nationalist, that vilified him as a racist, is suddenly sympathetic. The same press that called him a threat to democracy is now defending him against Rupert Lowe. Why? Because they know that as long as Farage keeps Reform weak, as long as he ensures the party never goes too far, he is no real threat to them. The establishment needs Farage to keep Reform UK in check. If Reform were a true anti-establishment movement, the media would be tearing it apart, just like they did to UKIP when it became a real problem. But instead, they are treating Reform as if it's already harmless. And that should tell you everything. This isn't the first time we've seen this play out. Look at UKIP. It was a force to be reckoned with, until it wasn't. Until leadership purges and sudden betrayals destroyed it from within. Until it was reduced to irrelevance, leaving millions of voters without a real alternative. Now it's happening again. Because the truth is, the system does not allow real opposition to exist. They create the illusion of choice, but they never allow it to become a real threat. And Reform UK? It's looking more and more like another political trap. A party that talks a big game but ultimately keeps voters exactly where the establishment wants them. Disillusioned, angry, but completely powerless. And if that's the case, then where does that leave Britain? It leaves us in a country where Labour is about to take power without any serious opposition. A country where the Tories will cling on just enough to pretend they still matter. A country where millions of people who desperately want change are being led in circles by a party that was never meant to succeed. And that is the biggest betrayal of all. Because Farage had a choice. He could have stood by his party's original mission. He could have fought for real change. He could have led a movement that actually challenged the status quo. But instead, he let Reform collapse. And the question that lingers is, was that the plan all along?